welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, coming at you on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and here with video on YouTube. All right, I have to start this off with a confession and a little bit of background here on this particular podcast episode, that I don't even understand why I am more than a little bit nervous and anxious, I think, actually, about this particular podcast. I have spent the greater part of the last 2 weeks researching this, probably more than any other thing that I've ever produced that I have done research on, except maybe for the video that I did on Bill Gothard's cult, the IBLP, and all of that based on that interview I did with Christiana. Which is the most watched video I've got on my channel, and if you haven't seen it, you should. This is about politics, and of course that's always a difficult subject to talk about because of the knee-jerk reactions and emotional responses that people have to that. And I'm not doing this podcast as a rant or as some kind of an opinion piece or as anything like that. And I have been critical of Donald Trump in the past, and that does upset some people. I'm sorry that you get upset about the way I feel about Donald Trump, but that's not at all the point of this podcast. What I wanted to do here is, well, first I just wanted to kind of comment, and I'm going to refer to an extensive amount of notes that I have for this podcast here, so you'll see me going back and forth if you're watching on video here. But I first wanted to speak to the nature, morality, and amorality of politics in general. I've really had my eyes opened over the last couple of years to this topic, because I, lived in a bubble world up until 5 years ago, and politics was never. I always thought it was kind of crazy town, and people were just sort of, would say anything, do anything, and all that. But it was a very generalized kind of idea about politics. I didn't follow it closely. I didn't know a lot about what goes on in the Beltway. I didn't pay a lot of attention to the issues at hand, because I figured, being part of Scientology, I was just part of the solution to all of that. And we were going to sort it all out, and it was all going to come out in the rinse, and everything was going to be fine, and we were going to create a whole new civilization anyway. So what was the point of following all this politics stuff? Well, of course, there's a lot of interest in this, especially over the last couple of years, because Donald Trump is a very controversial figure, and he has brought his family on board, and there's been a lot of people who have been part of the administration, both on the campaign trail and after his victory, who have been in the press for lots of different reasons, and we're going to go over some of those reasons in this podcast. And it is, I didn't get into talking about politics because I want to be a political pundit. I got into it because I am something of an expert in destructive cults at this point. And when you find out about or learn about cult thinking, you learn about a lot of the ugly side of humanity. And oddly, I found when Donald Trump announced, and I started following the election cycle more closely and really paying attention to what he was saying and what Hillary was saying and Bernie was saying and Jill Stein and, these guys, I started noticing a lot of the same characteristics and qualities of cult leaders in these politicians, all of them. And most specifically, I was critical of Donald Trump because of what I perceived to be and still believe to be a lot of narcissistic qualities. And that's a very dangerous thing to have, as a, narcissistic personality disorder is a thing. I'm not pretending to be a, trained clinician who can accurately, diagnose somebody over TV. But I just noted from my observations of his, business activities and the way he talked and the way he, discusses things and his style that there seemed to be a lot of those characteristics there. And then I noted, of course, in the bigger picture, as more time passed and I spent more time educating myself about the left as well as the right, that these characteristics for all of us citizens really start coming out, these cultic characteristics. By that I mean things like, the end justifies the means, anything goes, politics is, a bloody, dirty business. And, you got to get them before they get you. And a lot of us versus them thinking, that is, where you have a group that is claiming on any side of any political aisle you want to look at here, it's our way or the highway. There is no compromise possible. This happens sometimes, not all the time. There are many times when bipartisan support exists for things, but generally speaking, there's, the us versus them, and the greed and the money play a major role. And it was only very recently that I started looking at the fact that people who are in these power positions, mainstream politicians at the federal level, certainly, I think that this is probably true at the state level as well, because that's where these federal people come from, are people of money. They have a lot of it. These are not people who have to check their wallet to see whether they can afford something or not. If they, they can look at something and go, I want that. And they have people who work for them. They have, they come from, often they come from affluent backgrounds, but not always. And when you move into that level of income bracket, your life at that level is very, very different than it is for the common person, you, me, Aunt Sally or Uncle Joe. They're operating at a whole different level where they no longer are going to have to worry about monetary problems for the rest of their lives. I mean, this kind of person doesn't think about the world the same way that we do. And I don't mean by doing this to try to set up a whole new us versus them. It kind of already exists, in our class system, which we sort of, have here in the United States. But I'm just talking about the day-to-day thinking process of somebody with a lot of money who doesn't have to worry about that anymore. They start worrying about a whole different, set of problems and concerns, and they concern themselves with getting more money, of course, if they can, but only as a means to an end to achieve more power and influence. Now, that's not inherently a bad thing. You can use power and influence for lots of good things, or not. And if you are so inclined to, sort of have your will dominate in the public discourse or through legislation or something, and you have the power and influence to do that, well, there's always going to be people who are going to disagree with you. So the views on, about you are going to be good or bad, depending on whether somebody agrees with what you're trying to accomplish or not. And we see some of the main names, thrown around: George Soros, the Koch brothers, or Koch brothers, I should say. But lots of people throw lots of money around, and but they're not doing it because they're, just trying to show off. They're doing it because they're trying to influence things. And if we agree with them, they're good, like I said, and if we don't, then they're bad. But these characteristics lend themselves to cult-like relationships. Okay, that was really the point I was trying to make in a very long roundabout way here, is that that's how I got interested in this. I didn't get interested in it because I'm fascinated by the political process. I'm interested in what goes on in Washington. I really don't care, and I wish that, I think in the end I have a really kind of a more conservative view that I want government to not be really this big overpowering thing. Yet at the same time, I have a lot of liberal ideas because I want government to recognize and do something about our human rights. And I happen to think, as I mentioned in last week's podcast, that I think healthcare is, a human right. For example, it's recognized by most countries as such, and in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as such. So America's a little bit behind on that. All right. So I just wanted to make that point that, that me talking about politics is not entirely off topic for my channel, and why I get into this. So, and it's not a matter of, when I look at my disagreements with Trump specifically, it's not really, there are very, very huge policy problems that I have with him, but that's not what drives me to talk about him. What drives me to talk about him is that there is a leader there who has, some pretty disturbing qualities and personality characteristics connected to him. And I feel the need to talk about that, because that's what I do on my channel, is I talk about dangerous people and what the influence they have over other people. I mean, if you really wanted to summarize what my channel's all about, that's kind of what it's all about. All right. Now, there was another analogy that I wanted to make here, moving on from Trump as a person. There's a tremendous amount of information that I've been processing over the last 2 weeks. And it's kind of like I've been looking at a clock or a machine, a well-tuned, lots of moving parts. And if you concentrate on only one or two of those pieces and what they're doing, then you can miss the bigger picture altogether. And our 24-hour news cycles and our media reporting tend to focus on whatever the latest and greatest is, and they just milk it and massage it and talk about it to death. But what they really fall down on is providing the bigger context of where these individual stories go. They try. I've been going over tons of media over the last couple of weeks about all kinds of things and all kinds of people and actors connected with Trump's campaign and Trump's administration. And so you see efforts here and there to try to fit these puzzle pieces together. But this podcast is going to be an effort to do a big picture look. And so, and that's something we're not really very good at, is backing up and looking at the larger context in which all the pieces fit. And so it can be really hard when you get a new puzzle piece, a new story comes out, some new outrage or some new thing to be upset about, and we go, rah, and we get upset about that one little thing, and we sort of contextualize it into this puzzle, that we have in our head of what we remember and what we put together and what the news tells us and what our friends tell us about what's going on. But, one of the reasons why when I was doing the Sensibly Speaking podcast before with Ruth, and by the way, this entire podcast we're doing today is all Ruth's fault, because she asked me a question and said, could you do a podcast on it? And that's what led to this whole thing. So, if you don't like this episode, you can blame her. Anyway, when we were doing our podcast, we were talking about the news of the day. And I stopped doing that specifically because it became very frustrating to talk about a news event that had just happened and not be able to contextualize it because we didn't have all the information about the news report. Not because of bad news reporting, but merely because often with crimes especially, all the information doesn't come out in the first hour or two or 24 or 48 or 72 hours. It takes weeks, even months, to properly contextualize pieces of information and news reports into, and investigations of those news reports into a full picture of exactly what happened. That's why the criminal justice system sometimes moves very slow. Often it moves way slower than it should. But, you kind of want it to sometimes because you want to give time to discover everything about what's going on. And that takes time. There's no way around it. So I felt that we were doing a disservice on my podcast by talking about the news of the day that had just happened within the last 24, 48 hours, because not all the data was available. And here we were making conclusions and assessing and forming judgments about these things. And really, we could end up being wrong 2 days later or a week later or a month later in our assessments. And I didn't really want to run a podcast that way, where I was just sort of mouthing off or ranting about something that had happened and giving bad feedback or bad data to you guys about the news, and it's never been my purpose to just be another talking head. So that's why this podcast changed, and I have been focusing on interviews or content or subject that I can research fully and give you a more complete picture about. And so that's what this podcast is an effort to do. Now, the other thing about this clock analogy is that all the pieces play their parts in a clock or a machine, and they all, or have their individual functions or roles, but some of these pieces are much more important than others. It's the same with the machine that makes up an election campaign or a presidential administration. You could say that the election team gets a big upgrade when they move into the White House. Some of the parts in the campaign aren't needed anymore and are replaced out with new parts that have new functions and uses, while others remain and continue working and contributing to the overall effort. The more complicated the machine, the harder it is to focus on the whole picture of it, especially when there are squeaky, noisy parts. And we've got tons of those in this administration, throughout the campaign and throughout the administration. And it gets, and they demand, those squeaky parts really demand a lot of attention. Sometimes they actively are pursuing that. They are opportunists. That's the only reason they're there, is to make noise. Notice me, notice me. And I'm sure you can think of some of the people that I'm talking about. And it's, some of those squeaky parts can actually be the least important or least effective or useful parts of the machine. But because they make a lot of noise, we end up paying a lot of attention to them. In the Trump campaign and the administration, such noisy parts include people like Omarosa, Kellyanne Conway, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, and Anthony Scaramucci. They can be interesting or annoying, depending on how much you enjoy listening to high-pitched squealing, but ultimately they're irrelevant to what's going on with the machine as a whole. What I want to focus on in this podcast are the more important pieces of the machine. Over the last 2 years, you've probably heard a great deal about some of them, and maybe not so much about some of the other parts or pieces. So what I want to focus on in the rest of this podcast here is basically a timeline of events and people, and not everybody, by a long shot. I want to focus in on specific people doing specific things, and I'll explain why each of the events are important and how they relate to each other. And we're going to be focusing on events that have to do mostly with criminal type activity on the part of the Trump campaign during and after the election cycle. We'll also talk about who was indicted for what. When I'm throwing around terms like criminal activity, I'm talking about activity that has earned indictments and guilty pleas. So this is not an opinion on my part that we're dealing with criminal activity, okay? I want to make that really clear. So first off, let's get a little historical context on a few things. Let's go all the way back to 1987. That was when Trump went to Moscow to find a site for a luxury hotel. No deal emerged. Now, I'm not going to lay out here every single time Trump went to Russia or had some kind of Russian deal, but I wanted to go back pretty far to establish a line of events here that show that Trump has been interested in building things in Russia. As a real estate developer, that's what he does, but he's been very interested in building stuff in Russia for a very long time. In 1996, Trump sought to build a condominium complex in Russia, but that deal also didn't succeed. Now let's move forward to 2004. Now in 2004, a guy named Paul Manafort first began to establish connections in the Ukraine. Now, Ukraine was ground zero in the geopolitical struggle between Putin's Russia and the West. His reputation as a masterful political strategist, this is Paul Manafort now, and a fixer was earned over decades hopping planes to the Congo, the Philippines, and elsewhere to advise authoritarian rulers friendly with the United States. By the end of 2004, the former Soviet Republic of Ukraine was paralyzed by widespread protests and allegations that Yanukovych, the prime minister in a government rife with corruption, had won the presidency in a rigged election. What became the Orange Revolution persisted until another internationally monitored vote was held and rival Viktor Yushchenko was declared the winner. Okay, that's all the way back in 2004. So in 2005, Trump signed a one-year deal with a New York development company to explore a Trump Tower in Moscow. But the effort fizzled. So again, he's still trying to get into Russia, and it's still not happening. But Manafort and a partner formed Davis Manafort Partners, Inc. in early 2005 and opened offices in Kiev. Manafort's first client in the Ukraine was Rinat Akhmetov, the country's richest man and a key funder of Yanukovych's Party of Regions. In the summer of 2005, Akhmetov tapped Manafort to help Yanukovych and his party in the 2006 elections. The multi-million-dollar deal of political consulting was sealed at a meeting in an elite Moscow hotel attended by Manafort, Akhmatov, and a half dozen other wealthy Ukrainians. Manafort spent the next several years advising Akhmatov and other Ukrainian oligarchs and giving the gruff-talking Yanukovych a makeover down to his hairstyle and his attire. And this has been covered quite well by the media, showing how this guy, Yanukovych, went from this really rough-looking guy to basically a carbon copy of Paul Manafort, even down to the suits and ties he would wear. So in 2007, there's a quote here. Quote, "Russia is one of the hottest places in the world for investment," said Donald Trump in a 2007 deposition. "We will be in Moscow at some point," he said. All right, now in 2008, Donald Trump Jr. was quoted as saying this: "Russians make up a pretty disproportionate cross-section of a lot of our assets." Now, he told this to a real estate conference in 2008, and this was according to an account posted on the E-Turbo News website, which was a trade publication. He said, quote, "We see a lot of money pouring in from Russia." Trump Jr. noted that he traveled to Russia 6 times in 18 months, and, quote, "Several buyers have been attracted to our projects there and everything associated therewith. But," he added, "as much as we want to take our business over there, Russia is just a different world. It's a question of who knows who, whose brother is paying off who. It really is a scary place." All right, now we move up to 2010. Viktor Yanukovych wins the presidency of the Ukraine. In addition to working for Yanukovych, Manafort also worked for the pro-Russian opposition Bloc Party and even went so far as to suggest the party take an anti-NATO stance. Now, this is pretty interesting. Manafort was really involved with this place. Flight records spanning from late 2004 through 2015, over all that time, show Manafort as a man on the move. Over those years, Manafort visited Ukraine at least 138 times. His trips between Ukraine and Moscow all occurred between 2005 and 2011 and were mostly in 2005 and 2006. In the recent indictments of Manafort, which we will get to, prosecutors have charged that he and his associate, Rick Gates, funneled through a maze of foreign accounts at least $75 million in consulting fees from an array of Kremlin-leaning clients. Russian billionaire Oleg Deripaska, who secretly paid them $10 million annually for several years, a second Ukrainian oligarch, and the ruling party of Regions, which supported Yanukovych until corruption allegations and bloody protests led to his overthrow in February 2014. All right, now in 2013, the Post reported that the Trump Organization had partnered with a man named Aras Agalarov, the so-called Trump of Russia, on a project in Moscow in 2013 that did not come to fruition. Quote, "The Trump Tower deal never moved past preliminary discussions," the Post said, but Agalarov said the family is interested in a possible future venture. Now, that name's going to come up again later. In 2013, he signed a preliminary agreement to build a tower in partnership with Aras Agalarov, a billionaire who had financed the Trump-owned Miss Universe pageant when it was held in Moscow in 2013. Agalarov told the Post last year that his company deal with Trump was on hold because of the presidential campaign. In 2013, also, and we're going to move on to somebody else for a second. We've been talking about Manafort. We've been talking about Trump. Now let's talk about a guy named Carter Page. Page met with Viktor Papadopolis in 2013. Now, Papadopolis was a junior attaché at the permanent mission of the Russian Federation to the United Nations. And they met at an energy conference, and Page provided Papadopolis with documents on the U.S. energy industry. Page later said he provided only basic immaterial information and publicly available research documents. Papadopolis was later one of a group of 3 Russian men charged by U.S. authorities for participation in a Russian spy ring. Papadopolis and one of the other men was protected by diplomatic immunity from prosecution, though. But a third man who was spying for the Russians under non-diplomatic cover pled guilty to conspiring to act as an unregistered foreign agent, and was sentenced to prison. The men had attempted to recruit Page to work for the Russian SVR. The FBI interviewed Page in 2013 as part of an investigation into the spy ring, but decided that he had not known the man was a spy, and they never accused Page of wrongdoing. But keep in mind the connection there. As part of the court filing, it was written that Podobny said, and this is kind of funny because Page was kind of blowing Podobny off, and Podobny was trying to get info out of Page and trying to recruit him. So Podobny said, Page wrote that he's sorry, he went to Moscow and forgot to check his inbox, but he wants to meet when he gets back. I think he's an idiot and forgot who I am. He got hooked on Gazprom, which was a Russian oil company, thinking that if they have a project, he could rise up. I also promised him a lot. This is intelligence method to cheat. How else to work with foreigners? You promise a favor for a favor. You get the documents from him and tell him to go fuck himself. So that's the quote from Podobny. All right, now in July 2013, getting back to Manafort, Manafort and his aide, Konstantin Kilimnik, flew from eastern Ukraine to Frankfurt in Germany. American experts on Russia said privately they suspect the trip was a prelude to a broader Russian influence effort to dissuade Yanukovych's government from signing an agreement to associate with the European Union. That decision, experts say, opened the door to Russia's 2014 invasion of eastern Ukraine. So now we go to 2014. And in February of 2014, there was a Ukrainian revolution. A series of violent events involving protesters, riot police, and unknown shooters in the capital of Kiev, which is where, again, Manafort had his office and had been consulting with Yanukovych all these years. And Yanukovych, of course, is the president of Ukraine. So this revolution in 2014 resulted in the ousting of Viktor Yanukovych and the overthrow of the Ukrainian government. The events were followed by a series of changes in Ukraine's socio-political system, including the formation of a new interim government, the restoration of the previous constitution, and a call to hold impromptu presidential elections within months. Opposition to the revolution in some eastern and southern regions escalated into the annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation, its later military intervention, and subsequent war in Donbas. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine endured years of corruption, mismanagement, lack of economic growth, currency devaluation, and problems in securing funding from public markets. Successive Ukrainian governments in the 2000s sought a closer relationship with the EU. One of the measures meant to achieve this was an association agreement with the European Union, which would have provided Ukraine with funds in return for liberalizing reforms. Yanukovych announced his intention to sign the agreement, but ultimately refused to do so at the last minute. Okay, so Yanukovych not interested in going with the EU. This failure to sign that agreement sparked a wave of protests called the Euromaidan movement. During these protests, Yanukovych signed a treaty and multi-billion-dollar loan with Russia. The Ukrainian security forces cracked down on the protesters, further inflaming the situation and resulting in a series of violent clashes in the streets of Kiev. As tensions rose, Yanukovych fled to Russia and did not return. And he's still there, by the way. So this is the guy Manafort was being paid millions and millions of dollars by in order to consult, in order to run his country. And the result was him out of the country and the country in bloody chaos, and part of the country being annexed by Russia. Now, Russia refused to recognize the new interim government, calling the overthrow of Yanukovych a coup d'etat, and began a military intervention in Ukraine. The newly appointed interim government of Ukraine signed the EU Association Agreement and agreed to reform the country's judiciary and political systems, as well as its financial and economic policies. The International Monetary Fund pledged more than $18 billion in loans contingent on Ukraine's adopting those reforms. The revolution was followed by pro-Russian unrest in some southeast regions, a standoff with Russia regarding the annexation of Crimea, and a war between the Ukrainian government and Russia-backed separatists in the Donbas. So, that's something Manafort contributed to and was part of, and that's why I'm talking about it here, because it's going to come up later. Now, Manafort's business, of course, took a hit when Yanukovych fled to Russia days before the Kremlin-backed forces moved into eastern Ukraine. And he was quickly hired by the opposition bloc, which leaned even more toward Moscow. And again, keep in mind, he's been making millions of dollars doing all of this work. So he got some rave reviews, Manafort did, from one Oppo bloc leader, a guy named Nestor Shufrich. Shufrich told a Ukrainian publication that Manafort urged the new party, the opposition bloc party, to take an anti-NATO stance and be the voice of Russians in Ukraine's east. Calling Manafort a genius, Shufrich said the party had paid him about $1 million and the investment paid off. Despite Ukraine's popular uprising against Yanukovych that led to at least 75 deaths, Paul Manafort maintained ties to the opposition bloc party and Viktor Yanukovych's former cronies, thus choosing to associate himself with crooks and kleptocrats rather than Ukraine's pro-Western reformers, said Mike Carpenter, who focused on Russia matters as a top Pentagon and National Security Council official during the Obama administration. Quote, "This speaks volumes about his character and lack of respect for democratic values." And also, it was in March, after all of this bloody nonsense went down, that President Obama started putting forward sweeping sanctions to punish Russia for its aggression towards the Ukraine and its annexation of Crimea. So if you're wondering what all those sanction talks are about with Russia, that's the background on it. That's why we are being as harsh, or one of the reasons we are being harsh with economic sanctions against Russia, Russian oligarchs, and that whole situation. All right, so now we move forward to about a year later, June 16th, 2015. Donald Trump announces his candidacy for President of the United States. And of course, that was in Trump Tower in New York City, and we all know the famous speech that he gave when he announced. So then let's move forward a little bit. The Trump campaign starts going forward in full speed, and we go to October 13th, 2015. Michael Cohen. Now, we all know or have heard his name. He was Trump's fixer, Trump's lawyer, Trump's go-to guy. Well, on October 13th, 2015, Michael Cohen was in touch with a Russian-born businessman who grew up in Brighton Beach and the Coney Island neighborhoods of Brooklyn, a man named Felix Sater. And he was in touch with Felix Sater about the Trump Tower deal when Trump was a Republican presidential candidate. Okay, they still have this tower deal going in Moscow. Sater first sent a letter of intent to Cohen outlining the terms of the Trump World Tower Moscow deal on October 13th. The Times, Andrei Rozov, a Russian investor, had already signed it by the time Sater forwarded it to Cohen for Trump's signature. The letter read, quote, "Let's make this happen and build a Trump Moscow, and possibly fix relations between the countries by showing everyone that commerce and business are much better and more practical than politics. That should be Putin's message as well, and we will help him agree on that message. Help world peace and make a lot of money. I would say that's a great lifetime goal for us to go after." All right. Now we come forward to November 3rd, and there is an email from Felix Sater to Michael Cohen, which in part reads, "Michael, we can own this story. Donald doesn't stare down, he negotiates and understands the economic issues, and Putin only wants to deal with a pragmatic leader, and a successful businessman is a good candidate for someone who knows how to negotiate. Business, politics, whatever, it all is the same for someone who knows how to deal." All right, so this Trump Tower deal is still going, even though the presidential campaign is going full speed, and there's this connection through Felix Sater and Michael Cohen to Russia and Russian business. Now, we come forward to January 2016. I don't have a specific date on this, but here's what happened in January. Michael Cohen wrote directly to Mr. Putin's spokesman, Dmitry S. Peskov, asking for help restarting the Trump Tower project, which had stalled. Quote, Over the past few months, I've been working with a company based in Russia regarding the development of a Trump Tower Moscow project in Moscow City. Without getting into lengthy specifics, the communication between our two sides has stalled. As this project is too important, I am hereby requesting your assistance. I respectfully request someone, preferably you, contact me so that I might discuss the specifics as well as arranging meetings with the appropriate individuals. I thank you in advance for your assistance and look forward to hearing from you soon. But Cohen didn't have Mr. Peskov's direct email and instead wrote to a general inbox for press inquiries, and the Kremlin did confirm that they received the email, but they never replied to it. And the deal, which reportedly would have given, okay, and this is another quote here from Cohen, would have given his company a $4 million upfront fee, no upfront costs, a percentage of the sales, and control over marketing and design. All right, so that all fell through in January 16, and Cohen tried to revive it, and it didn't really go. Now, we're going to talk about someone else. Slowly, we're bringing more and more people on board here, okay? And all I'm giving you all this background for is just to establish some context to what comes later, okay? Thank you for being patient with me on all of this because we got a lot to cover, but I just want you to get the full background on this. All of this timeline with a whole lot more information, by the way, than what I'm reading you here. I've only selected bits and pieces. The entire timeline I put together is on the show notes for this podcast at sensiblyspeaking.com. So you can go to that and refer to all the events that I'm talking about in sequence on my website there. All right, so now we're going to talk about another player named George Papadopolis. Now, on March 6th of 2016, George Papadopolis was recruited to join Trump's campaign, and specifically the foreign policy advisor team, by a guy named Sam Clovis, who at the time was the national co-chairman of Donald Trump's campaign team. Clovis allegedly told Papadopoulos that one of the campaign's foreign policy priorities was to improve U.S.-Russia relations. Now, Clovis later denied saying that, but Papadopoulos certainly seemed to take words like that to heart based on his later actions. That was on March 6th that he was recruited. On March 14th, again, this is 2016, while traveling in Italy, George Papadopoulos met a guy named Joseph Mifsud, who was a London-based professor with connections to high-ranking Russian officials. Now, Mifsud attended meetings of the Valdai Discussion Club regularly, which is an annual conference held in Sochi, Russia, and is also attended by Vladimir Putin. So this guy, Joseph Mifsud, the London-based professor, has direct connections to all kinds of people in Russia and attends this conference that even Putin attends. So the next day, on March 15th, and this is kind of interesting now, there's an indictment that we will get to from the Mueller team of 12 Russian military officers. And a lot of the data that I'm putting into this timeline comes from that indictment. According to that indictment, on March 15th, this is the time period when the Russian GRU set up two units, Unit 26165 and Unit 74455, or at least this is the time. I don't know if they set up these units at this time, but this is the time when these two units begin engaging in cyber operations that involved the staged releases of documents stolen through computer intrusions. Now, we're going to get to a lot of specifics of how they went about doing that, because it's all laid out in this indictment in amazing detail. As to how they went about eventually hacking the DNC and the DCCC. But at this point, on March 15th, 2016, is the first mention we have of them, of these two units, and they ran, a guy named Yermakov in that unit ran a technical query for the DNC's internet protocol configurations. So he was kind of going in there just like you could with your home network and looking for which devices were connected to this network. And he started looking for open source information about the DNC network, the Democratic Party, and specifically Hillary Clinton. So that all starts March 15th, 2016. Now on March 19th, 4 days later, they start sending this GRU unit starts, which is a Russian military intelligence unit, starts sending spear phishing emails to the personal accounts of individuals associated with the Clinton campaign, including the campaign manager and a senior foreign policy advisor. Now, spear phishing is an email that gets sent, and it's targeted at a specific individual or department within an organization that appears to be from a trusted source. It's actually cyber criminals attempting to steal confidential information. Okay, that's spear phishing, and you're going to hear that term a few times. So this is when they sent their first spear phishing efforts out. It was on March 19th. On March 21st, 2016, Donald Trump gives an interview with the editorial board of the Washington Post. In that interview, he identified George Papadopolis as one of his campaign's foreign policy advisors, saying he's an energy and oil consultant, excellent guy. He also announced Carter Page as a foreign policy advisor. All right, now on that same day that Trump is talking to the Washington Post editorial board, the GRU stole the contents of the Clinton campaign chairman's email account, which consisted of over 50,000 emails. That was the day they did it. The next day, Hillary Clinton presidential campaign staffer William Reinhart is phished by an IP address from the Ukraine, and they succeed in getting his Gmail account and password. This was all, of course, found out after the fact, not that day. He was successfully phished, which means he had no idea he had given over his information to bad actors, Russians in the GRU. Now, on March 24th, just 2 days later, George Papadopoulos is back in London, and he's meeting with Professor Mifsud, who brought along with him a Russian woman named Olga Polanskaya, whom he falsely identified as Putin's niece. Okay, so Papadopoulos thought he was meeting Putin's niece. He wasn't. He was meeting Olga Polanskaya. The next day, the GRU is continuing their phishing, and a guy named Lukashev, one of the 12 GRU officers who was later indicted, used the John 356 GH account to mask additional links included in spear phishing emails, which he sent out to numerous individuals affiliated with the Clinton campaign, which he came at it with an account that he had spoofed to make it look like something else, and they just started going to town on trying to get as many Clinton staffers as possible to respond so they could get their credentials. Because when they phish someone, that means that they convince that person to go log on to a fake site, which looks real, and enter their account name and their password. And once they do that, then the bad actors, over in the GRU in this case, have their logon information. And the person who's giving it to them has no idea that they've just given it over to bad people. So over the next few days, on March 28th, according to the indictment later on, they're spear phishing tons of people and getting stolen email credentials and thousands of emails as a result from numerous individuals associated with the Clinton campaign. So now, in April is the time period when the Russians hacked the computer network of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, the DCCC, and the Democratic National Committee, the DNC. They covertly monitored the computers of dozens of DCCC and DNC employees, implanted hundreds of files containing malicious computer code, and stole emails and other documents. And they began to plan the release of the stolen materials. Now, between April and June, the GRU installed multiple versions of what was called the Agent Malware. And that was how they actually got the information that they were looking for, because they installed it first on at least 10 DCCC computers, which allowed them to monitor individual computer activity, steal passwords, and maintain access to the network. What the Agent did is it would take screenshots periodically of what was going on the computer it was installed on. And it was also logging all the keystrokes. So any key that got pressed was being logged. So when somebody came and logged on, they would get that person's account name and password. And if whatever they were looking at on the screen, they'd get screenshots of that, and they'd get hundreds of these a day through this malware. And they installed this malware on tons and tons of computers. And what they did is the malware transmitted the information from the computers to a GRU leased server in Arizona. So this happened on American soil. This the malware was sending the information to this server in Arizona, and that's the server in Arizona they called the AMS panel. That's what they called it. And so the Russians would log on to their server and get the download of all this information from the malware, and that's how they conducted operations to start with. All right, now something very important happened on April 19th of that same month, that same time period. There was a domain registered called dcleaks.com. And this was registered on the thcservers.com, founded in a chicken farm in Romania. Although later on, this might have changed because the Mueller indictment says that the servers were located in Malaysia. And the funds used to pay for the dcleaks.com originated from the same account at an online cryptocurrency service that the GRU had used to lease a virtual private server and to register that John 356GH account that I referred to earlier, which was used to spearfish the Clinton campaign. So you see these things tied together. DC Leaks is registered and it's paid for. Same money is used to set up this other thing that we know the GRU was using. And they were able to remotely configure an overseas computer to relay communications between that malware and the server, the AMS panel in Arizona. And then they tested that ability to send this information through this new middle server, which they dubbed the middle server. And this was a proxy to obscure the connection between the malware and the AMS panel and the GRU. Okay, so they're setting up this whole little network of sneaky in order to get this information and keep downloading it on a daily basis. They're getting this information. All right, now let's go back to Papadopolis. On April 26th, about a week after the last thing we just talked about, at a London hotel, Joseph Mifsud told George Papadopoulos that he had just learned from high-level Russian officials in Moscow that the Russians had dirt on Mrs. Clinton in the form of thousands of emails. And by this point, this was fresh information. They had just within the last couple weeks been downloading the hacked information. So this guy, Joseph Mifsud, was pretty Johnny on the spot here on getting this information to George Papadopoulos. This was way before there was any public knowledge about any hacks or anything. This, as far as I can tell, this is the first instance of anybody reaching out to somebody in the Trump campaign and saying, we've got some dirt. And there were numerous instances of this, which we're going to go over. So Papadopoulos is told about this at the end of April. So sometime in May, Papadopoulos tells the top Australian diplomat to the United Kingdom, Alexander Downer is his name, that Russia had political dirt on Hillary Clinton, leading the FBI to open a counterintelligence investigation into the Trump presidential campaign. Now, the way that happened is it wasn't a direct thing. Papadopoulos didn't alert the FBI. What happened was Alexander Downer gets in contact with the Australian ambassador to the United States, a guy named Joe Hockey. And Hockey, he tells them, hey, Papadopoulos is telling me there's this, dirt that being offered through Russia. So Joe Hockey then contacts the FBI very quietly and says, I'm being told, by my guy in the UK that Papadopoulos, who works for Trump, is being offered dirt on Hillary. That is what set off the FBI investigation, as far as we know. Based on all reports to hand, it was this report from the Australians that got the FBI all over finding out, wait a minute, what the hell's going on with Trump's campaign? And they started investigating this. It's been conjectured by a lot of people, way too many, who have not put all the dots together and put all the dates together, that it was the Steele Dossier that prompted the FBI to start investigating the Trump campaign. But the Steele Dossier didn't even come into the picture yet. That, we don't know exactly precisely when that was given over to the FBI, but as far as I can tell from everything I've been reading here, it was after the fact of this Australian alert and heads up to the FBI. So now getting back to Papadopolis here, the professor introduced Papadopolis to a Russian who said he was close to officials at the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That contact, which was later identified by the Washington Post as Ivan Timofeev of the Russian International Affairs Council, he spoke with Papadopoulos over Skype about laying the groundwork for a meeting between the campaign and officials in Moscow. Okay, so Papadopoulos is fully aware of the fact that this is coming from the Russian government. Now, the Russian woman, whom Papadopoulos mistakenly described in an email as the niece of Russian President Vladimir Putin, also tried to arrange a meeting between the Trump campaign and Russian government officials. So, we've got Papadopoulos going two different ways here. Now, on May 3rd, as this is going down, Trump becomes the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party after his victory in Indiana and the withdrawal of his last competitors, Ted Cruz and John Kasich. So just so you know where we stand in the race right now compared to where these events are occurring. Between March and September of 2016, George Papadopoulos made at least 6 requests for Trump or representatives of his campaign to meet in Russia with Russian politicians. In May, campaign chairman now, Paul Manafort, remember him from the whole Ukraine fiasco? Well, now he's the campaign chairman of Trump's campaign. And he forwarded one such request from Papadopoulos to his deputy, Rick Gates, saying, quote, we need someone to communicate that Trump is not doing these trips to Moscow. It should be someone low level in the campaign so as not to send any signal, is what Manafort said. So Gates gets this task, and he delegates the task to the campaign's correspondence coordinator. So this kind of goes down the food chain within the Trump campaign. Now, the recipients of the emails about the outreach from the Russian government reportedly that Papadopoulos was sending were Clovis, Corey Lewandowski, Manafort, Gates, a representative of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ivan Timofeev, and other people. Okay, so Papadopoulos is doing everything he can to try to set this thing up and get something going. So clearly he believed that there was something vital and valuable for the Trump campaign being offered by the Russian government. Okay, now on May 31st, 2016, at the end of May, the DCCC and the DNC start becoming aware that they've been hacked, and they hire a private security company called CrowdStrike to identify the extent of the intrusion. And on this date, Yermakov, over in one of the GRU guys, searched for open source information about CrowdStrike and its reporting on Agent, which was the malware, the name of the malware they used. So the GRU was aware of the fact that the DNC and the DCCC were aware of the hacking. So on June 1st, the GRU attempted to delete all traces of their presence on the DCCC and DNC networks. On June 3rd, this is another, now we're going to go to another player and a whole nother tangent on this, okay, if you're following along so far with all of this. On June 3rd, 2006, 2 days after they are trying to delete traces of their hacking, Donald Trump Jr. receives an email from a guy named Rob Goldstone, who was a British publicist who does work in Russia. And Goldstone wrote that he was writing at the behest of Aras Agalarov. Remember him? He was the guy who was trying to set up the Trump Tower, Moscow setup. So Aras and Emin Agalarov, and Emin is Aras's son. They're a father-son pair of real estate developers who do business in Russia. And Emin is also a Russian pop star, by the way. So in the email to Donald Trump Jr., Goldstone said that a Russian prosecutor had met with Aras and offered to provide the Trump campaign with some official documents and information that would incriminate Hillary and her dealings with Russia and would be very useful to your father, end quote. Crucially, he made it clear that the information would be part of Russia and its government's support for Mr. Trump, helped along by Aras and Emin. Now, Trump Jr. responds enthusiastically. If it's what you say, I love it, especially later in the summer. Because at this point, they were having campaign chairman turnover, and they were worried about some other things. They were trying to nail Trump's, they were trying to make sure he was going to get the nomination from the Republican National Committee, because it wasn't clear at that point that that was actually what was going to happen. So anyway, he responds to this and says, hey, this sounds really good. I love it. Goldstone then helped set up a phone call between Trump Jr. and Emin Agalarov, and later arranged a meeting between Trump Jr. and someone he calls the Russian government attorney who's flying over from Moscow. So the president's son invited Jared Kushner and then campaign chair Paul Manafort to attend the meeting and forwarded the email chain to them both. Now, just to be clear about a little fine point in regards to that email that Don Jr. received, Goldstone wrote, quote, "The Crown Prosecutor of Russia met with his father Aras this morning, and in their meeting offered to provide the Trump campaign with some official documents and information that would incriminate Hillary and her dealings with Russia and would be very useful to your father." So he mentions here this thing about a Crown Prosecutor. Now, there is no such thing as a Crown Prosecutor in the Russian judicial system. So there was an article about this in The Atlantic, and they surmised that what they were talking about here with a Crown Prosecutor is a federal prosecutor, because there's no position in Russia that fits that. The analog would be the top federal prosecutor of Russia, and that is a man named Yuri Chaika, who's the Prosecutor General of the Russian Federation. And by the way, if you look at that Atlantic story and Chaika's past, you'll see it's pretty shady and corrupt. All right, so now we go back to some of this hacking information, because on June 8th of 2016, which is just 5 days later after Trump Jr. gets this email, on June 8th, the DC Leaks Twitter and Facebook accounts debut, along with the site dcleaks.com. They all launch same day, June 8th. The site claimed it was started by a group of American hacktivists, but that was false. The Facebook account was set up by Alice Donovan, quote unquote. Other false Facebook accounts were used to promote the site. There was a Facebook account under the name of Jason Scott and another one under Richard Gingrey, but this was all traced later on back directly to these GRU units. The DC Leaks site was used later to release stolen emails, and we're going to go over all the specifics of how that happened. And a Twitter account, at DC Leaks _ was operated on the same computer used for the other efforts to interfere with the presidential election, because they set up a whole ton of Twitter accounts. I mean, there was one called Baltimore is Were, where and that Twitter account encouraged U.S. audiences to join our flash mob opposing Clinton, and posted images with the hashtag Blacks Against Hillary. And there were many, many, many of these things. All right, so that all happens. That setup happens of these accounts, the social media accounts, and the dcleaks.com site on June 8th. On June 9th is when the famous meeting at Trump Tower happens. And I'm not going to belabor the point of what happened in that meeting. I did read the transcript that Donald Trump Jr.'s testimony to Congress, the Senate Judiciary Committee, about that, and he seemed to have an amazing case of amnesia in regards to what happened at that meeting and all the contacts at it. And we'll go into some of the specifics on that. Now, we don't know exactly what happened at that meeting besides Don Jr.'s testimony to Congress about it. That testimony was not under oath. However, it is a crime to lie to Congress in that kind of testimony, and that was made clear to Don Jr., and he was there with his lawyers. But like I said, most of his testimony was, I don't know, I don't remember. So, it's possible that there might be more information to develop about that meeting. Now, 5 days after that meeting happened on June 9th, on June 14th, the DNC announced via CrowdStrike that it had been hacked by the Russian government. On that same day of June 14th, the GRU guys registered the domain actblues.com, which mimicked the domain of a political fundraising platform that included a DCCC donations page. Shortly after, they used stolen DCCC credentials to modify the DCCC website to redirect visitors to their own artificial actblues.com domain. And so when people were donating to the DCCC, they were actually giving money straight to the GRU offices in Moscow. Now, the next day, on June 15th, is when Guccifer 2.0 makes his first appearance. And Guccifer 2.0 was a pseudonym used by the GRU offices, again, all according to Mueller's indictment of these GRU officers. So June 15th is when a blog created on WordPress goes on, and Guccifer 2.0 puts up a post called DNC's Servers Hacked by a Lone Hacker. That's the title of the post. And he wrote, quote, worldwide known cybersecurity company CrowdStrike announced that the Democratic National Committee servers had been hacked by sophisticated hacker groups. I'm very pleased the company appreciated my skills so highly. But in fact, it was easy, very easy. Guccifer may have been the first one who penetrated Hillary Clinton's and other Democrats' mail servers, but he certainly wasn't the last. No wonder any other hacker could easily get access to the DNC's servers. Shame on CrowdStrike. Do you think I've been in the DNC's networks for almost a year and saved only 2 documents? Do you really believe it? Here are just a few docs from many thousands I extracted when hacking into DNC's network. And then he posted links and shots of actual hacked documents from the DNC servers. He said, he continued here in this post, the main part of the papers, thousands of files and mails I gave to WikiLeaks. They will publish them soon. I guess CrowdStrike customers should think twice about companies' competence. Fuck the Illuminati and their conspiracies. Fuck CrowdStrike. Okay, so that's all quoted from that first post. Now, 3 days later, Guccifer's second post goes up on WordPress, and he gives out more leaked information. On June 20th, Corey Lewandowski gets fired, reportedly in response to lagging fundraising and campaign infrastructure, as well as power struggles within the campaign. And Paul Manafort, Trump's campaign chairman, who was brought in during the primary to prepare for a contested convention, assumed the role of chief strategist. So the hacking is happening. Manafort is moving up the chain within the Trump campaign, and or at least is assuming more and more responsibilities. And Guccifer just keeps posting through June here more and more hacked information from the DNC servers is coming out, but it's only on DCleaks.com. Nothing's happened on WikiLeaks yet. He made mention of WikiLeaks, but nothing else has happened in regards to that. And Guccifer starts talking about refers to his Twitter account and is working on that. Now, also on this date of June 22nd is when WikiLeaks sent a private message to Guccifer 2.0, I'm assuming probably through Twitter or Facebook, with the message, quote, send any new material stolen from the DNC here for us to review, and it will have a much higher impact than what you are doing. So this is WikiLeaks actually reaching out to them to get the goods. Okay, now on June 27th, something kind of interesting happened. Guccifer is pretty active at this point. And remember, Guccifer is this GRU unit in Moscow. So Guccifer reaches out to another site called The Smoking Gun, or TSG. But Guccifer 2.0 doesn't say that he's responsible or connected at all with DCleaks.com. He's only been posting so far on his own blog, on this WordPress blog. So now he contacts The Smoking Gun, and he says he has material that's available through DC Leaks, which he claims is a website that is sort of a sub-project of WikiLeaks. It's not WikiLeaks, it's not connected to WikiLeaks, but it's kind of connected. And he says that he had asked the DC leaks to release a part of the staff correspondence they had hacked, but with a closed access. And he offers TSG a password with which they can access this material on dcleaks.com. And he said, please don't make any announcements about this yet. And, so they don't ask, so I ask you not to make links to my blog, okay? So he's telling them that he is not DC Leaks, but he's connected, and he's offering them a password so they can get information that has been uploaded on dcleaks.com. So the Smoking Gun site accepts this offer, and they get emailed a password, and that provides them access to emails and documents that were stolen from Sarah Hamilton's Gmail account 3 months earlier. And then he writes back to the Smoking Gun, let me know your opinion, to be continued, ... So now we've got this Guccifer offering connection to DC Leaks, but he's saying, I'm not DC Leaks, but I'm going to give you a password that's going to give you information that's on that site that nobody else has, thereby proving that he's got an inside line into this DC Leaks site. Now we go into July 2016. And during this month, a couple interesting things happened. Weeks after he was named Trump's campaign chairman, Manafort crafted an unusual, eyebrow-raising proposal for Deripaska, a member of Putin's inner circle. In emails first reported by the Washington Post, Manafort offered in seemingly coded language to provide private briefings, quote-unquote, on the U.S. presidential race for the Russian aluminum magnate, this guy, Deripaska. Manafort directed a trusted associate named Konstantin Kalimnik to relay his message to Deripaska, remarking that it could be a way to make himself whole, which is possibly an allusion to a multi-million-dollar legal action Deripaska had filed against Manafort. So you get the picture here. Manafort's the campaign manager for Trump, and he's saying, I got a way to give you some inside information to make up for this, suit that you're filing against me, so maybe we can make a deal. Now, Kalimnik was a Ukrainian citizen, and he had actually once attended a Russian military academy for training spies. So Manafort, Kalimnik, shady dealings going on here. We know that happened in July. Also in July, the FBI was surveilling Carter Page. Remember, Carter Page was the guy who had been they tried to recruit him. He was so dumb, he didn't even realize that was what was happening, and he got blown off by these guys after providing them with documents that they had asked for. And Carter Page loves Russia. He loves being involved in Russia, and he thought he'd be able to make it big with an oil company over there, and that didn't pan out, but he was still very pro-Russia. So Carter Page goes over to Russia, and he delivers a commencement address at the New Economic School. However, that's not all he did on that trip. In addition to that, Page met with Igor Sechin, a longtime Putin associate and former Russian deputy minister who is now the executive chairman of Rosneft. At their meeting, Sechin raised the issue of lifting of sanctions with Page. Now, Page is now a foreign policy advisor, remember, on the Trump campaign. Trump himself said so to the Washington Post editorial board earlier. So Page also met not only with Igor Sechin, but also with Igor Nikolaevich Divyekin. Okay, I love these Russian names. And this guy, Divyekin, is a former Russian security official who now serves as deputy chief for internal policy and is believed by U.S. officials to have responsibility for intelligence collected by Russian agencies about the U.S. election. So Divyekin has some inside skinny on this info that's been collected by the GRU, and we already know in the timeline that the GRU has hacked all these emails and hacked all this information, and it's starting to be released through the Guccifer WordPress site. So, and through DC Leaks, right? But very, very quietly. So Divyekin meets with Page. And the agenda for the meeting included Divyekin raising a dossier or compromat that the Kremlin possessed on Clinton and the possibility of it being released to Trump's campaign. Okay, so now we've got Papadopolis being offered information via this London professor, and we've got Carter Page being offered information through his meeting with Igor Sechin and Divyakin. Sechin saying, hey, let's lift these sanctions, and Divyakin saying, we've got compromise on Clinton. Okay? Now, on July 6th, Guccifer is continuing to make posts and leaks on his WordPress site. And also on this date, and we're coming up here, we are on July 6th, WikiLeaks messages Guccifer and said, if you have anything Hillary related, we want it in the next 2 days, preferable, because DNC convention is approaching and she will solidify Bernie supporters behind her after. The response from Guccifer 2.0 was, okay, ... I see. So WikiLeaks explained, quote, we think Trump has only a 25% chance of winning against Hillary, ... So conflict between Bernie and Hillary is interesting. All right. So again, this behind the scenes communications happening. So on July 14th, Guccifer 2.0 posts his 7th WordPress article called New DNC Docs. And he says, you may have read about my new release in the media this time, as I can see it. Many of you wish to have a look through the docs with your own eyes, so I don't have courage to keep you unaware any longer. And he posts more DNC spreadsheets and documents. But also, on this date, the GRU, posing as Guccifer 2.0, sent WikiLeaks an email with an attachment titled WK DNC Link 1. And they explained that the encrypted file contained instructions on how to access an online archive of stolen DNC documents. So, and then WikiLeaks a couple days later confirmed that they received the 1 gigabytes or so archive and that they would be making those documents public that week. And in fact, it was only 4 days later, on July 22nd, that WikiLeaks published the hacked emails from John Podesta's server. And John Podesta was the chairman of Hillary's election campaign. It included 19,252 emails and 8,034 attachments from the DNC. The leak includes emails from 7 key DNC staff members and date from January 2015 to May 2016. And of course, for any of you guys who know or looked at what those emails said, they of course had discussions about sabotaging Bernie's campaign and many other things. And of course, that was released very strategically just before the DNC convention. Now, as a result of that email leak, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the DNC chairman, resigned right away. Then, of course, they held the convention. Now, there was something else that happened here, which was also kind of interesting. On the day that WikiLeaks dumped all the emails and made them public, Rob Goldstone emailed Rona Graff. Now, Rob Goldstone is the guy who emailed Don Trump Jr. earlier to try and set up that meeting, which had happened already on June 9th. Now, Rob Goldstone emails Rona Graff, who is Trump's executive assistant, and he says, Emin, remember Emin and Aris? So he says, Emin has an email invite for Mr. Trump to attend his father's 60th birthday in Moscow on November 8th. And Rona writes back, I'll certainly make Mr. Trump aware of this invitation, but, you know, the campaign, it's very unlikely he'll be able to attend. And Mr. Goldstone replies, I totally understand Moscow, unless maybe we would welcome a meeting with President Putin, which Emin would set up. And I don't know what the response to that email was, but Trump clearly did not go to Moscow to meet with President Putin for that birthday on November 8th, so they must have declined. However, I found it fascinating digging around in the various sources that I've been going through, and this one particularly came from that Don Jr. testimony to the Senate Judiciary Committee. They had dug up this email exchange between Goldstone and Trump's executive assistant. So again, direct forays being made right to Donald Trump at this point. Hey man, get over to Russia, meet with Putin. Let's set this up, man. Let's make this happen. So there's a lot of interested parties on the side of Russia trying to reach out to the Trump campaign on numerous vectors to give them this hacked information and try to get them the dirt on Hillary, and trying to get them to set up meetings with Russians. And then, of course, on July 27th at a press conference, Donald Trump says the following: "I have nothing to do with Russia. I have nothing to do with Russia for anything. What do I have to do with Russia? The closest I came to Russia, I bought a house a number of years ago in Palm Beach, Florida. Palm Beach is a very expensive place. There was a man who went bankrupt, and I bought the house for $40 million, and I sold it to a Russian for $100 million, including brokerage commissions. So I sold it. So I bought it for 40. I sold it for 100 to a Russian. That was a number of years ago. I guess probably I sell condos to Russians, okay?" Okay, now remember everything I've already gone over, and now Trump is saying this, okay? I mean, the numerous attempts to get Trump Towers set up in Russia, and this is, I got nothing to do with Russia. Now, he went on to say that he doubted that Russia was behind the DNC hackings, but that he hoped there would be more email releases to come. He said, quote, "Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing, Clinton's emails. I think you will probably be rewarded mightily by our press. Let's see if that happens. That will be next." Okay, he said that. Now, it wasn't clear if he was joking or not, but that is the last press conference that Trump gave during the entire campaign. Now, literally that same day, the GRU attempted after hours to spearfish for the first time the email accounts at a domain hosted by a third-party provider and used by Clinton's personal office. Okay, so they had hacked the DNC, they'd hacked the DCCC, they'd gotten individual staffers' emails, they'd gotten John Podesta's emails, but they had not ever gone after Hillary's emails until the day Trump said that at a press conference. That's the day that Russia went after Hillary's personal emails. Now, it doesn't indicate all by itself that Trump broke a law. It's just a bit of a coincidence. On August 2nd, as fallout from the whole DNC email hack, not only did Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the DNC chairman, resign, but also the CEO, the CFO, and the communications director also resigned, basically wiping out the entire executive structure of the DNC. On August 8th of 2016, Roger Stone told a conference of Republicans, quote, "I actually have communicated with Assange. I believe the next tranche of his documents pertain to the Clinton Foundation, but there's no telling what the October surprise may be." Stone kept talking about his connection with WikiLeaks and his supposed backdoor information that he had via an intermediary that he claimed. He said that he didn't have direct contact with Assange, but he had this intermediary, and he was getting all this information about WikiLeaks, and he kept promising new emails, new dumps, new information like this. He did this for months and months until finally he had to start backpedaling, because once it started coming out that there was actual criminal activity going on between WikiLeaks and the GRU and Guccifer, who Roger Stone stupidly was talking to and having back and forths with, not apparently realizing that he was talking to Russian military, he started backing off on some of his claims, but Roger Stone being Roger Stone, he didn't back off too much. So here's this DCleaks.com site that has hacked information on it, but so far, Guccifer had given a password to the Smoking Gun news site, and they had gotten in there and they had gotten those emails of Sarah Hamilton's, but they hadn't let it be known that Guccifer is the one who had given that to them. On August 12th of 2016, the Smoking Gun reported it had connected the DCleaks.com site to Guccifer 2.0, which, this mysterious hacker who was, Now, at this point, it's thought that this is a Russian cover-up operation. Nobody's totally sure exactly what's going on or where this is happening, but that's what's thought. So Threat Connect reviewed the exchanges between Guccifer 2.0 and the Smoking Gun and concluded that Guccifer 2.0 was intricately linked behind the scenes to DCLeaks.com. After examining the digital exchanges, Threat Connect concluded, quote, "We assess that DC Leaks is another Russian influence operation, possibly put on by the same Russian actors behind the Guccifer 2.0 persona. DC Leaks content had not had nearly the same impact as the leak of 20,000 hacked DNC emails that appeared on the WikiLeaks site, though. So DC Leaks was kind of over here doing its thing, and Guccifer was doing his thing on his WordPress site, but they really got the bullhorn treatment and big exposure when WikiLeaks got their information and published it on the WikiLeaks site. Now, interestingly, there's some information buried in the GRU indictment by Robert Mueller that came out in this year, later on after all of this, that indicates that on August 15th, Guccifer 2.0 received a request for stolen documents from a candidate for U.S. Congress. It's not stated who. The GRU responded using Guccifer 2.0 and sent the candidate stolen documents related to the candidate's opposition. So, there's other people getting on board this gravy train here. Now, on August 17th of 2016 is when Manafort had to leave the campaign because of his connections to President Yanukovych and other Ukrainian people and Russian dictators and oligarchs. And this starts coming out in the media, and it becomes this big shitstorm, and Manafort leaves the campaign, and Bannon takes over as chief executive for the campaign and promoted Kellyanne Conway to campaign manager to replace Paul Manafort. Now, on August 22nd, a week after this mysterious congressional candidate gets information from Guccifer 2.0, Guccifer 2.0 transferred approximately 2.5 gigabytes of stolen data from the DCCC to a then registered state lobbyist, an online source of political news. The stolen data included donor records and personal ID info for more than 2,000 Democratic donors. They also sent a reporter stolen docs pertaining to Black Lives Matter. The reporter responded by discussing when to release the docs and offering to write an article about their release. I don't know who that reporter or lobbyist are. It would be interesting to find out. Now, all this hacking is going on, and it's been found out about, and the DNC has announced it, and Guccifer has been labeled as a Russian operative, and they had even tried to erase all traces of their hacking so that they wouldn't be found. Yet in September, they successfully gained access to the DNC computers again, this time through a whole nother cloud computing service. And I won't go into all the details of it, but basically they got snapshots of the cloud-based accounts, and they were able to steal more data from the DNC. Now, remember our friend Carter Page. He had met with the Russians. They tried to recruit him. Then later on, he met with two people over in Russia who tried to get him to lower the sanctions and offered him the Clinton dirt. Well, on September 26th, he left the campaign because he said he had never met with Sechin or Divyakin, but he was going to take a leave of absence because the accusations were a distraction. However, in October, the following month, even after leaving the campaign, the FBI was still surveilling him through the FISA warrants that they were getting against him, because they still believed that this guy had connections, and they had good reason to believe that, and they were still following him around. On October 7th of 2016, there was a joint statement issued from the Department of Homeland Security and the Office of the National Intelligence on Election Security, which basically said that they were confident that the Russians were the ones behind the hacking. On October 31st is the first time that I believe I could find any reference to this, that Mother Jones magazine reported that an unnamed former intelligence officer had produced a report, which became later known as the Steele Dossier, which was based on Russian sources and had turned it over to the FBI. And the FBI found Steele and his information credible enough that it considered paying Steele to continue collecting information, but the release of the document to the public stopped discussions between Steele and the FBI because now he was blown as a public figure. Now, I'd like to make a point here regarding the Steele dossier. I read the whole thing, and a lot of the information in it matched up with much of what was found in the investigations by the FBI and the special counsel. And some, there's been a lot of black talk or black PR of the Steele dossier. There's been a lot of derision of Christopher Steele as a resource, that the Hillary campaign hired him, which they didn't, et cetera, et cetera. And I just want to make a point that Christopher Steele was a British intelligence officer who had absolutely no reason whatsoever to lie or put false information into his the dossier report of information he was giving to the people who had hired him to put this information together. It was never imagined that this information was going to go public. And as a person who his stock in trade is information, it would be a black mark against him, and it would prevent future hires or people wanting to seek him out to hire him for things if it was known that he was purposefully putting malicious or false information into his reports. So the guy didn't have any reason to make up information about Trump or about any part of what's contained in the dossier. And I think that's important to keep that in mind, just from a point of view of like motivation and critical thinking about what that was all about. He just didn't have any reason to put false information in there, and he wasn't doing this with the idea that that information was ever going to become public. So, I think I think when you look at the credibility of that document, the information might not be true, but it's according to sources that this guy is contacting in Russia. So if he's being fed false information, that's one thing. But so far, most of the information in that dossier has turned out to be true. All right, so coming down the home stretch now, on November 8th of 2016, Donald Trump wins the presidency. And by December 2016, the campaign attorney, Don McGahn, who's Trump's attorney, they are way distancing themselves from Carter Page now. They're like, dude, you need to stop saying that you're connected to our campaign. We never had anything to do with you. You never met Trump. You are merely one of the many people named as a Foreign Policy Advisory Committee back in March. We're disavowing you. Okay. So that happened in December. Also on December 9th is when the CIA told U.S. legislators that the U.S. Intelligence Committee concluded that Russia had conducted operations against the 2016 U.S. election to prevent Hillary Clinton from winning the presidency. In fact, multiple U.S. intelligence agencies concluded that people with direct ties to the Kremlin gave WikiLeaks hacked emails from the Democratic National Committee. Now, you remember back when I was talking about Michael Cohen and Felix Sater and how they had been trying to set up that Trump Tower Moscow deal? Well, that wasn't the only thing they were working on over in Russia. In January of 2017, it came to light that a guy named Andrei Artemenko was expelled from the Ukraine legislature and his citizenship was revoked after disclosures that he and Michael Cohen had pitched a peace plan for the Ukraine and Russia, widely seen as favoring Moscow. The plan, which Andrei Artemenko, Felix Sater, and Michael Cohen had pushed, would have the U.S. lift sanctions on Russia in exchange for Moscow's withdrawing its support for pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine. It would also allow Russia to maintain control over the territory of Crimea, which, remember, it had annexed back in 2014. So all that talk I was giving you about Ukraine was background for Manafort, but it was also part of what Cohen and Sater were working on. Felix Sater, remember, and so much so that the Ukraine got so pissed off about this peace plan that they had put together and that they had forwarded to Michael Flynn, the national security advisor at this time, that they kicked this Ukrainian out and actually kicked him out of the, took away his citizenship. So Cohen wasn't just fixing porn star accounts over here, as we have been told at, length, which he did do, but he was also setting up this peace plan for the Ukraine. Mr. Cohen told the Times in no uncertain terms that he delivered the Ukraine proposal to Michael Flynn's office at the White House, said the Times deputy managing editor. Mr. Sater told the Times that Mr. Cohen had told him the same thing. Cohen confirmed some details of the Times story to the Post, saying that he met with Sater and Artemenko at a hotel in Manhattan in late January 2017 to discuss the plan, and he left with the plan in hand and took it to Michael Flynn. So by January 6th, the United States government's intelligence agencies had basically concluded Russian interference was pretty much done. That was how the joint U.S. intelligence community felt. That's what's their assessment of what was going on. Now, in January 27th of 2017, George Papadopolis, after being interviewed by FBI agents, shut down his Facebook account, which had contained correspondences with Russians, and he created a new one. So Papadopoulos is like, oh God, and trying to cover his tracks. Now also on this day is, just to kind of place this in the timeline again for everybody, is when the same day Papadopoulos is shutting down his Facebook account is the same day that Executive Order 13769 goes into, is basically signed by Trump, which Bannon and Stephen Miller had put together to ban Muslims from entering the country. That was that same day. Now we go forward to February 14th when President Trump meets with FBI Director James Comey and tells him, I hope you can see your way clear to letting this go, to letting Flynn go. He's a good guy. Remember that conversation, which we've heard so much about. Comey subsequently testified that I had understood the president to be requesting that we drop any investigation of Flynn in connection with false statements about his conversations with the Russian ambassador in December. I did not understand the president to be talking about the broader investigation into Russia or possible links to his campaign. The propriety and even the legality of these words that Trump reportedly said to Comey about Flynn have become a subject of considerable public debate. But several months after dismissing Flynn, Trump got rid of Comey too. In fact, in March of 2017, Director of National Intelligence Daniel Coates reportedly told his associates that Trump had asked him to get Comey to back off. So, clearly there was some interest there in making something stop happening in regards to the Russian investigation and getting rid of Flynn. On May 17th of 2017 is when Acting Attorney General Rod Rosenstein appointed Mueller as special counsel, and he began his investigation into any links and or coordination between the Russian government and individuals associated with the campaign of President Donald Trump. On July 27th, 2017, George Papadopoulos was arrested at Washington Dulles Airport and started cooperating almost immediately with the Mueller investigation. We move forward to September 7th, and that is the day that Donald Trump Jr. gave testimony to the Senate Judiciary Committee, I should say, and that he said that he met with Jared Kushner and Paul Manafort at 4 p.m. with Rob Goldstone and Natalia Veselnitskaya and the translator and some others at Trump Tower, and seemed to display an incredibly poor memory or a profound ignorance of who else was on the campaign, and he was lying about what he knows or doesn't know. We really can't tell. On October 5th of 2017 is when George Papadopoulos struck a cooperation agreement with Special Counsel Robert Mueller, secretly pleading guilty to lying to federal officials or federal agents about his contacts with Kremlin-connected Russians. He had, as we know, he had met with Professor Mifsud, and they had been offering, and he thought he had met Putin's niece, and he lied to the FBI about those meetings, and he tried to downplay it and make it seem like something else had happened. So they busted him because they found out through other sources that that's not what happened, and then they got him to cooperate. And this news came to light in court documents that were unsealed on October 30th, but it was actually October 5th when that actually went down. Now, of course, immediately following the guilty plea, Trump belittled Papadopoulos as a young, low-level volunteer named George who's already proven to be a liar, and said few people in his campaign had heard about Papadopoulos. Now remember, Papadopoulos was also the guy who was emailing everybody and their brother about trying to set up this meeting for months. He was emailing over and over again to please, let's make this happen because these guys got something. So he was not somebody who nobody knew about on the campaign. All right, now just a few weeks later, on October 27th, 2017, Paul Manafort and Rick Gates were indicted on 12 counts, including conspiracy to launder money, conspiracy against the United States, being an unregistered agent of a foreign principal, false and misleading statements, and other charges. Now, they face decades in federal prison and millions of dollars in potential fines if convicted on all the counts in a sprawling federal indictment. In fact, Manafort faces up to 80 years in prison, according to one review of the statutes. And Gates, who worked for the Trump campaign and was close with Manafort all those years, faces up to 70 years. The indictment says that up to $75 million flowed through overseas accounts controlled by these two guys. Manafort is alleged to have laundered more than $18 million he used to buy property and goods in the United States. Gates is alleged to have transferred more than $3 million to accounts he controlled. Now, none of these crimes that they're being indicted for have anything to do with colluding with Russia in regards to the campaign. These all have to do with criminal activities they were involved in regards to the Ukraine and Russian contacts that they'd been developing since 2004, remember, when they opened their office in Kiev, okay? And I got a whole breakdown of all of the crimes and the sentences for them, but we're way into this, so I'm just going to move on here. You can look up the indictment online. I've read the entire thing. There are a lot of counts. Now, this was the initial indictment, okay? There are more indictments of Manafort coming. It didn't stop here. Now, on November 3rd of 2017, a guy named Alex van der Zwaan was interviewed by the FBI, and he lied to them about the timing and nature of his last communications with Gates and an unidentified Ukrainian-based long-term associate of Manafort, who's only identified as person A in the indictment, but later comes out to be Konstantin Kilimnik, which was the other guy that had been working with Manafort. In the interview, van der Zwaan had said that his last communication with Gates was an innocuous text in August 2016 and blah, blah, blah. But basically he tried, again, he, like Papadopolis, tried to get away with some things with the special counselor investigators, and he did not get away with it, and they busted him. So that was van der Zwaan. Not a key player in anything having to do with the campaign collusion with the dirt, with the Hillary emails, but van der Zwaan was a fatality of lying and somebody in the orbit of Manafort and Gates and that whole business and the Ukraine stuff. So that's how he got roped into this, and that's how he became the first guy to be found guilty and actually went to prison for 30 days, got a $20,000 fine, and ended up getting, which he's now served, by the way, and he was deported to the Netherlands. And his father is one of the famous Russian oligarch. So that's van der Zwaan's connection to this whole thing. On December 1st of 2017 is when Mueller agreed to a plea bargain with Michael Flynn, who had been the national security advisor but had gotten busted because he had lied. Now, his deal was a whole separate thing. He had been working with Turkey, and he had met with the ambassador to Russia after the election was done, but before Trump became president. He was still president-elect. And Flynn met with the Russian ambassador and tried and had discussions about lifting Russian sanctions, which was not okay. He didn't have the authorization to be doing that. And then he lied about it. He lied about it to Mike Pence. He lied about it to the investigators. And so he got busted because they had what happened on tape, I guess, the phone calls and the discussions. And so Flynn ended up getting busted off of his job and had to enter into this plea bargain where he willfully and knowingly made false, fictitious, and fraudulent statements to the FBI. So that was the end of Michael Flynn's career with the Trump administration. So again, he was not also busted for Russian interference with the election per se, but he was collateral damage from the whole investigation because he was up to no good. And if you dig into the details of that, you find out that he actually was really up to no good because he was over in Turkey in 2017, and he was working on, trying to work out some deals with them to even kidnap the opposition party's leader. I mean, there was a whole kerfluffle with that. So he had to resign as national security advisor, and because he was subject to blackmail because he had been doing naughty things. On February 20th of this year now, we're now into 2018, is when Alex van der Zwaan actually pled guilty. And on February 22nd, there were more charges brought against Paul Manafort and Rick Gates. They were first charged with 12 counts, right, on October 30th. And they both pled not guilty. But Gates is expected to plead guilty and testify against Manafort. Now, this is as of February 22nd. So the new superseding indictment includes 16 counts related to false individual income tax returns, 7 counts of failure to file reports of foreign bank and financial accounts, 5 counts of bank fraud conspiracy, and 4 counts of bank fraud. When Manafort and Gates were working for Yanukovych, money was funneled into offshore accounts and used to buy U.S. real estate, according to the indictment. Manafort is charged with not reporting more than $13.7 million in accounts hidden offshore. After Yanukovych was ousted, Manafort and Gates obtained more than $20 million in loans secured by the properties, according to the indictment, allowing Manafort to have the benefits of liquid income without paying taxes on it. So basically, this is all a big tax fraud situation where they're making all this money over in the Ukraine from these deals with these guys for consulting and whatever other services they're offering, and they're trying to hide it, and they're laundering the money, and they're not paying their taxes, and Manafort is getting, and Gates are being raked over the coals by Mueller on this. Now, it seems pretty clear that Mueller is being raked over the coals on this because he has personal knowledge of things that Mueller wants to know about, and he's not coughing. And so they are busting them hard for their financial crimes. That's basically what's going on with Manafort and Gates. Now, Manafort's dealings were pretty dirty. This is not just a couple cases of not reporting some income on his tax filings. Manafort and Gates defrauded the lenders in various ways by submitting phony income statements, lying about their debt, lying about Manafort's use of the property, and the loan proceeds. Prosecutors say Manafort's real estate dealings sometimes included multiple frauds for a single property. In 2012, for example, Manafort bought a condominium in the Soho neighborhood of Manhattan with $2.85 million in cash sent through accounts in Cyprus, a banking secrecy haven. He used it as an investment property, generating thousands in payments from Airbnb. In late 2015, applying for a mortgage, he claimed that his daughter and son-in-law were living there, and told his son-in-law to lie to the bank appraiser. He also concealed his debts and filed a false insurance statement. Not every attempt at fraud worked. When Manafort wanted to buy a property in Bridgehampton, New York, Gates offered the bank a phony invoice for a Democratic Development Consulting project worth $2.4 million. The loan was denied. Okay, so the new charges come as Gates' legal strategy and defense team are in flux. So he's losing his lawyers, getting new lawyers, and this stuff is just going round and round. Okay, so check this out. So all this is going on. Mueller is busting these guys. There are ties with Papadopolis. We know about the Trump Tower meeting and the emails leading up to it. We know about Carter Page and the fact that he was meeting with people and lying about it and being followed around by the FBI, and that he was approached about dirt on Hillary. So in the face of all of this that is still actively up in the air being investigated, the House of Representatives, the House Intelligence Committee, formally ended its Russian investigation on March 22, 2018, voting along party lines to release a final report that asserts there was no evidence of collusion involving the Trump campaign. So they're like, oh no, there's nothing here, nothing to see. The Democrats on that committee are up in arms, going, no way, we're going to release our own report because you guys are crazy. This is crazy talk. They didn't even interview Steve Bannon. I mean, there were so many people that they could have called in front of the committee to interview and find out more about this, and they didn't. They just closed it off. And that was Devin Nunes, remember, and various other Dems on the House Intelligence Committee, which is a different committee from the Senate Intelligence Committee, which had its own deal and is still going. On April 9th of this year, FBI agents raided Michael Cohen's office looking for records about payments to two women who they claim had affairs with Donald Trump, as well as information relating to the role of the publisher of the National Enquirer in silencing one of the women. The search warrant carried out by the Public Corruption Unit of the United States Attorney's Office in Manhattan sought information about Karen McDougal, a former Playboy model who claims she carried on a nearly year-long affair with Mr. Trump shortly after the birth of his youngest son in 2006. And she says she was paid $150,000 by American Media, Inc., which is the National Enquirer company, or parent company. And you'll recall that the head of that company is named Mr. Pecker, and we'll talk about him in a minute. So the FBI searched for records regarding the payment to those two porn actresses or models, and also got a whole bunch of information about Michael Cohen's ownership of taxi medallions and his own personal income tax filings and financial dealings. And using that information, they were able to later on indict Cohen, which we'll get to. Now, on June 8th comes indictment number 3 for Paul Manafort. This one for witness tampering. Okay? Paul Manafort, as well as Russian citizen and former Manafort operative Konstantin Kilimnik. The superseding indictment, which was the third one, came days after Mueller asked a judge to revoke Manafort's $10 million bail and jail him because of alleged efforts to tamper with potential witnesses at his upcoming trials, I should say. Manafort and Kilimnik were both charged with obstructing justice and conspiracy to obstruct justice by using intimidation or force against a witness, and also with tampering with a witness, victim, or informant. So keep in mind that by July of this year, the Mueller investigation had obtained indictments or guilty pleas from 32 individuals and 3 Russian companies. So this investigation has not been idle or fruitless, and it's certainly not been a witch hunt. On July 13th, 2018 is when Mueller indicted the 12 Russian military officials. And that group was known famously as Fancy Bear, the GRU units that we've been talking so much about. And that he said in the indictment that they were responsible for the DNC attack, for Guccifer 2.0, and all the rest. And he named them by name, by unit, even named the location of where they were operating out of Moscow, and what exactly each individual GRU officer's responsibilities and duties were in the units that they were either supervising or working in. So this indictment is quite a read, and I'd suggest that if you're at all interested in the facts of all of this, that you take a look at that. Now, remember, the House Intelligence Committee had said, oh, no, there's no Russian interference. Well, on July 18th of this year, the Senate Intelligence Committee concurred with the intelligence and open source assessments that this influence campaign was approved by President Putin. In a report that endorsed as sound the intelligence findings issued in January 2017. The committee said there was a body of intelligence to support the assessment that Putin and the Russian government developed a clear preference for Trump. Intelligence Chairman Richard Burr, a North Carolina Republican, said that after 16 months of investigation, his panel sees no reason to dispute the conclusions reached by the Intelligence Committee. The committee continues its investigation, and I am hopeful that this installment of the committee's work will soon be followed by additional summaries providing the American people with clarity around Russia's activities regarding U.S. elections. So I just want to point out here that if you're following the House Intelligence Committee, you might think that they said this is all just a big nothing burger. But the Senate Intelligence Committee said the exact opposite. And that was a quote from a North Carolina Republican there concluding that. So not everybody in the GOP is wholly, working against this whole thing. Now, speeding right along here, on July 26th of this year, Alan Weisselberg, the chief financial officer of the Trump Organization, had been subpoenaed to testify before a federal grand jury in the criminal probe of Michael Cohen. And that was a fairly significant subpoena because that was the guy who has been holding the purse strings for the Trump Organization for many, many, many years, like all the way back to the year 2000 when he became the CFO. So Weisselberg being subpoenaed is kind of a big deal. Another thing of note in regards to that Trump Tower meeting that I thought I would bring up here along this trail of events is that on August 6th, this year, Donald Trump tweeted out something that changed the entire cover story for what that Trump Tower meeting was about. Up until this tweet, the cover story basically said that they met and that this Russian woman brought up adoption policy in the Magnitsky Act, and that this was some big problem that they wanted to solve, and that's all that was really covered in the meeting. However, and they said they were making it clear that it wasn't about getting dirt on Hillary. That wasn't what this whole thing was for. Maybe there was some opposition research they would offer, but that they'd very much been downplaying that Don Jr. had wanted to meet because of getting this dirt. Well, then Donald Trump tweets, "Fake news reporting, a complete fabrication that I am concerned about the meeting my wonderful son Donald had in Trump Tower. This was a meeting to get information on an opponent. Totally legal and done all the time in politics, and it went nowhere. I did not know about it, exclaim." Now, I'm just pointing out that that's a very different explanation from what Trump said 13 months prior when he literally dictated a statement released under the name of Don Jr., which said, we primarily discussed a program about the adoption of Russian children that was active and popular with American families years ago. So, bit of a reversal there, and I just wanted to point that out. On August 21st of this year, Michael Cohen surrendered to authorities and pled guilty to 8 counts of tax invasion, bank fraud, and campaign finance violations, including 2 counts related to hush money payments made to women that he said he made at the direction of Donald Trump, including porn actress Stormy Daniels. And he has recently reportedly admitted that the payment was made at the discretion of the candidate, i.e. Trump. Cohen, who remember was the president's personal attorney, has given sworn testimony in open court that he committed campaign finance violations in coordination with and at the direction of the president. And this is because Trump is not named specifically in the indictment. He is considered an unindicted co-conspirator, and that's where that comes from. And it's very clear in the indictment that Trump definitely meets the criteria of unindicted co-conspirator. And just so you don't take my opinion for it, there are cited a few examples of law professors from various prestigious universities who weighed in on the Cohen guilty plea and what was said in open court. Lisa Kern-Griffin, a law professor at Duke University, said, "This turn in the president's fortunes is dramatic and damaging, and it should have political repercussions even if it does not have immediate legal ones. All of this is occurring in the Southern District of New York and involves wrongdoing in addition to the campaign activities that are the focus of the special counsel's investigations." And another person, Joshua Dressler, a law professor at Ohio State University, said, "Cohen's admission that the hush money that constituted 2 felony convictions was done at the discretion of a candidate for federal office clearly implicates the president in those campaign violations. Essentially, Cohen, under oath in a federal court, has alleged that the president of the United States conspired to violate federal law. If he were not a sitting president, this would constitute grounds for indictment on those charges. As a sitting president, this constitutes, if Congress wishes to do so, impeachable offenses. But, as we know, impeachment is a political rather than a legal concept, and it would seem pretty clear that nothing will occur with the current Congress." Now, something to make clear here is with Cohen pleading guilty to that, he's not done talking. And there is a potentially much larger threat to the Trump family from the Southern District of New York prosecutors who are New York State and not connected to Robert Mueller's investigation of Russian interference in the election. Cohen has been subpoenaed by the Southern District of New York about potential crimes committed by Trump and members of his family that are unrelated to the Russian probe. Because he was their fixer for so many years and he was an integral part of the Trump organization, he probably has quite a bit to say. And now it appears that he has the incentive to start talking. In fact, just to get another legal opinion on this, here is a quote from a former FBI agent and senior lecturer at Yale University, Asha Rangappa, who said, quote, "If Cohen provided information on potentially criminal activities to the Southern District and it opened an investigation into them, it would place the president in a double bind. First, since it would be an investigation separate and apart from the Mueller probe, he wouldn't be able to argue that the special counsel exceeded his mandate or crossed a red line. After all, any U.S. Attorney's Office is legally authorized and duty-bound to investigate any violations of federal law it learns about. More importantly, such an investigation would be completely insulated from any steps Trump might take to fire Mueller, or Rod Rosenstein, or even Attorney General Jeff Sessions. So Trump has much more to fear from Cohen than just what he knows about the Russian-related matters." And on August 22nd of this year, prosecutors in the Southern District of New York subpoenaed Michael Cohen as part of a probe of the Trump Foundation. Quote, "A subpoena has been issued to Michael Cohen for relevant information in light of the public discourses made yesterday," said a spokesman for the New York State Department of Taxation and Finance. And if you're wondering what is it that the Southern District of New York would go after the Trump Foundation or the Trump family for, well, the New York office, the Southern District of New York, was originally being run, or was earlier being run by Schneiderman, who had to retire, and is now under Barbara Underwood as the Attorney General. They're investigating an unlawful $25,000 donation made by Mr. Trump's nonprofit to a political action committee supporting Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi. Nonprofits like the Trump Foundation are barred by the IRS from contributing to political campaigns. Mr. Trump's campaign has blamed clerical mix-ups for the improper payment. They are also investigating more than $250,000 of the foundation's money that was allegedly used to settle legal disputes and pay fines on behalf of Mr. Trump's for-profit businesses. Those alleged payments were reported by the Washington Post, and on September 30th, the Attorney General issued a cease and desist order prohibiting the Trump Foundation from soliciting donations in New York for failing to properly register with the state's Charities Bureau. Now, as treasurer of the foundation, remember Mr. Weiselberg, the CFO of Trump Foundation? Well, he's also the treasurer of the Trump Foundation and is responsible for its finances, and he's been subpoenaed. Now, in terms of the Trump Foundation, and if you're wondering who's, on the board, who's responsible here, well, as treasurer of the foundation, Mr. Weiselberg is responsible for its finances. As its president, Mr. Trump, along with 3 of Mr. Trump's children, serve as directors. The question is, did they know what was going on? Said Kenneth Breyer, an attorney with Breyer & Gantz, which specializes in tax issues for charities. Now, on August 23rd, the next day, David Pecker, the publisher of National Enquirer and longtime friend of Donald Trump, as well as Pecker's top lieutenant, Australian journalist Dylan Howard, have been granted immunity by federal prosecutors in their investigation into Michael Cohen. So, being offered immunity and accepting immunity are 2 different steps. So apparently they've accepted that immunity, which means they've got goods to dish on, and they're dishing. And on the next day, August 24th, Alan Weiselberg, who is the Trump Organization's CFO, and also serves as the treasurer of the Trump Foundation, was also granted immunity by prosecutors in their ongoing investigation of Trump's longtime personal lawyer and fixer Michael Cohen. The significance of his flip, paired with Cohen's recent plea deal, cannot be overstated. It took slightly more than a year for 2 of the president's longest-serving employees, considered by many to be the last who would ever turn on him, to cooperate with federal investigators, and in Cohen's case, directly implicate Trump in a crime. But the news also marked a turning point in the legal assault on Trump world. Southern District of New York prosecutors may now pose a more immediate threat to the president than Bob Mueller does. This whole thing, quote, is a classic move in investigations of a criminal organization, said Patrick Cotter, a former federal prosecutor who was part of the team that convicted the Gambino family boss John Gotti. Quote, they're moving up the ladder. Peripheral characters are given immunity. Witnesses testify, but they're ultimately keeping their eye on the prize, end quote. One of the attorneys said, immunity is not given out like candy. I used it quite a bit in mob cases for people on the fringes of criminality. But Weiselberg, for example, they're saying, is not the real bad guy here. In a business where you're not the owner, when you misreport expenses, the real benefit goes to the company, not the employee, no matter how high level. So they're just slowly been moving up the food chain here, basically, is the point I'm making. And they're pretty close to the top now. So that is what's happening with this entire campaign and presidency and the legal machinations, I guess you could say, being levied against them. And this is pretty serious. Now, there's been a lot of breakdown here about whether collusion is a crime, whether conspiring with a foreign state is a crime when it comes to election laws and this kind of thing. Now, this podcast has gone pretty long, so I'm not going to read from all the statutes of all the laws that might apply here. But I'm going to tell you that in my research, I found that there are quite a few laws that actually are potentially being violated when one participates in collusion or an agreement deal, you could say, with a foreign national or with a foreign government. And this is not a really difficult thing to assess in terms of whether this is a foreign actor or not. We know who was involved, who did the DNC hack, or at least we have very good intelligence that indicates it was the Russians through this GRU, these two units of the GRU. So, and then we have multiple forays into the Trump campaign by Russians on multiple vectors in order to get them to try to meet, to get this dirt. And then we've even got that day where Trump is saying, hey, Russia, if you're listening, and Russia was listening. So there's a fairly strong case here to be made about certain laws that are being violated or potentially being violated. And these laws have to do with campaign finance. And it's actually quite an interesting little jaunt down the legal line trying to figure this stuff out. And like I said, I'm not going to get into all the specifics of all the laws because I'm not a lawyer and it would take way too long to lay it all out for you. But I just want to get across in the podcast here that this is not a nothing burger, despite what Fox News has been reporting or saying or trying to deflect or misdirect on. There are laws that apply to all of this activity, and those are the laws that are going to be pursued on all of this, and that's why all this information gathering and people turning and accepting plea deals or accepting immunity from prosecution in exchange for their testimony is going to be a pretty big deal here, okay? And again, we've got two different investigations going. We have a federal investigation of Russian interference, which is Robert Mueller's investigation, and we have the Southern District of New York. Trump might be able to pardon federal offenses if he so deems. I think that my personal opinion is that would be the ultimate in, cronyism to give Manafort, for example, a pardon for all these financial crimes he's been engaged in. I really can't think of any sensible, logical reason he would be compelled to do that. But clearly the pressure is on Manafort right now to talk, and he hasn't been talking. So we'll see what ends up happening with his, he's already been found guilty. There's more to be done on his indictments. There's more active cases that he has to go through the court system on. So we're going to see where Manafort ends up. Gates is already pleading, is looks like he's making a plea deal. And again, the Southern District of New York. Now, that whole activity that's state legal activity. So what the Southern District finds or prosecutes are not pardonable offenses. So that's why the Southern District of New York cases could be even more damaging to Trump and his family than the Russian investigation. So this is all very much up in the air right now, but I wanted to give some clarity and information about all this. And yeah, we got a lot of loose strings right now that are out there that I've been going through this whole trail on. But I think I've talked long enough about all this. I hope that all of this was not too overwhelming. It probably was, but I wanted to get it all out. This is the result of weeks of work on my part to lay all this out. It's a podcast, so I didn't have a whole lot of fancy graphics or anything to throw into this, or the time to even put all that together after all I've done with all of this. But I hope that this was informative, educational, and maybe somewhat entertaining. So thanks for coming along and listening to everything I had to say on this, and I will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.